The city of Ouagadougou sleeps under a heavy silence. The streetlights flicker, soldiers trade shifts in the dark, and somewhere inside the presidential compound, the youngest head of state on earth studies a list of names men he once trusted. The whispers have returned. Plan B, they call it. A secret plot whispered in corridors and coded in convoys. Not a war of bullets, but of betrayal. They say history never repeats, but in Africa it often rhymes in the language of coups and funerals. From Patrice Lumumba to Thomas Sankara, those who tried to take back their nation's wealth rarely lived to see their dreams realized. And now, almost 40 years later, another soldier has stepped into that dangerous rhythm, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the leader of Burkina Faso. He is not fighting rebels. He is not fighting terrorists. He is fighting shadows, the kind that move behind closed doors in Paris, Washington, and even within his own walls. Because for every African leader who dares to say, "Our resources are ours," there are a dozen forces waiting to remind him who truly rules the world. But what if this time the story ends differently? What if the youngest president alive has learned the lessons of every fallen one before him? What if he could turn fear into strategy and betrayal into rebirth? This is not just a story about one man's survival. It's about the soul of a continent. It's about whether Africa can stand without permission and whether its leaders can protect that dream before the world's old powers extinguish it again. Stay with us till the end. Because the move Ibrahim Traoré made last month may not only save his nation, it might rewrite the very meaning of African independence. It began with fragments, an intercepted radio call here, a suspicious convoy there. Then one chilling message from an informant inside the capital, they've activated Plan B. No one needed a manual to know what that meant. For decades, it had been the unspoken code in the neo-colonial playbook: when persuasion fails, elimination follows. Inside the presidential compound in Ouagadougou, the air grew still. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, barely 36 and already carrying the weight of a continent's hopes, looked across the map spread before him. Every red dot marked an ally, every blue one a risk. He understood something his predecessors once underestimated: coups are not born in the streets. They begin in conference rooms whispered between men who believe they can purchase the future. So in the dead of night, the order went out. Code Amber. Communication lines were rerouted through encrypted channels. Convoy routes changed every morning, sometimes chosen by a random algorithm minutes before departure. The palace perimeter thickened, snipers on rooftops, drone surveillance on standby. No one entered without dual clearance. Even his most loyal guards were rotated every 6 hours, shuffled like cards to break any predictable pattern. Still, this wasn't a siege. It was a purge of illusion. Traoré wasn't hiding. He was testing loyalty. Every handshake, every salute, every late-night meeting became a mirror, reflecting who would stand and who would sell. In the war of shadows, suspicion is the only weapon that doesn't jam. Yet he knew he couldn't afford paranoia. The moment he ruled through fear, he would lose what he was fighting for: trust. So he chose vigilance over vengeance. By dawn, Ouagadougou looked deceptively peaceful. Markets opened, children walked to school, and the radio carried soft patriotic songs. But behind that calm, the capital pulsed with quiet tension. Soldiers patrolled without insignias. Ministers spoke in coded phrases. A foreign journalist was quietly deported. And through it all, Traoré appeared in uniform before thousands at the Independence Square, raising his fist and declaring, "We are not afraid." Those 4 words cut through the city like thunder. To his people, they were reassurance. To his enemies, defiance. Because everyone watching understood he knew exactly what was coming. The threat wasn't theoretical. Intelligence briefings pointed to 3 possible vectors of attack. First, the insider plot: a handful of officers promised stability in exchange for betrayal. Second, foreign covert operatives, specialists who erase problems before they become symbols. Third, opportunistic extremists, armed groups waiting for any spark of chaos to march on the capital. Any one of these could topple a young state. Combined, they could burn West Africa. Yet instead of retreating into secrecy, Traoré did something few expected: he made his danger public. He let the people know that Burkina Faso was under psychological siege. "If they make me disappear," he told a crowd, "it will not be me who dies. It will be every African dream that refuses to bow." That moment changed everything. Fear began to shift. The hunted became the hunter of narratives. Behind the scenes, his team built what insiders later called the Triple Shield. Physical protection, elite guards, rapid response units, and hardened presidential zones. Information control, isolation of leaks, fake networks to confuse spies, backup data channels. Public legitimacy, the idea that any attack on him was an attack on the republic itself. He was no longer defending just a man's life, but a movement's meaning. Because Ibrahim Traoré understood one bitter truth: power doesn't corrupt in Africa, it provokes. The moment a leader stops taking orders from abroad, his life stops belonging to him. And as the whispers of Plan B spread through embassies and media rooms, one thing became clear: the world's youngest president wasn't waiting for the storm. He was already inside it and rewriting the rules of survival from within. The tension inside Ouagadougou had reached its breaking point. The whispers were no longer whispers, they were signatures on secret documents, anonymous deposits into shadow accounts, and coded meetings inside foreign embassies. The word stability began appearing in the same sentences as succession. It was the oldest script in Africa's tragedy, a coup prepared not with tanks, but with telephone calls and promises of peace. But Ibrahim Traoré wasn't new to history. He had studied the pattern: the quiet dinners before Lumumba's fall, the smiling handshakes that preceded Sankara's murder. He knew the smell of betrayal. And yet, instead of hiding behind walls, he walked straight into the light. On a humid evening, he stood before thousands of citizens gathered in Revolution Square. The air crackled with electricity. "We are not afraid," he shouted again, but this time his voice carried something heavier than courage. It carried defiance wrapped in prophecy. "If I must fall, let it be standing." The crowd erupted. Farmers, miners, students, mothers, every face reflected the same unspoken vow: Burkina Faso will not bow again. That night marked the turning point. Because when people begin to believe, power begins to shift. The narrative that was meant to isolate him had become his greatest weapon. Across the continent, the tremor spread. In Mali and Niger, two nations also ruled by soldiers tired of foreign dictates, his words echoed like a call to arms. Within weeks, the Alliance of Sahel States was born, a pact pledging mutual defense against any foreign intervention. What began as one man's survival had become a continental declaration. The age of puppets is over. Paris called it reckless. Washington labeled it destabilizing. But in the streets of Bamako and Niamey, murals of Traoré began to appear beside those of Sankara and Lumumba. To millions, he was no longer just a captain. He was a symbol, a living reminder that Africa could still resist. Yet symbols are dangerous. To the old powers, Traoré's defiance was a contagion. His decision to nationalize gold mines, audit foreign contracts, and reroute Burkina Faso's military cooperation toward Moscow and Bamako sent shockwaves through Western boardrooms. Because what he challenged wasn't just politics, it was profit. Western media outlets began their counteroffensive. Headlines warned of democratic backsliding. Analysts questioned his sanity. Anonymous diplomats whispered of human rights concerns, but the more they attacked, the more his message spread. On social media, young Africans quoted his speeches. In markets, traders played his words on portable radios. Still within Burkina Faso, danger brewed. The coup plotters adjusted their tactics. If they couldn't strike from outside, they would rot him from within. Disillusioned officers whispered about lost privileges. Old politicians saw opportunity in chaos. Some even invoked democracy not as a principle, but as camouflage for their own return to power. Inside the palace, Traoré's advisors debated how to respond. Expose them publicly, one said. Silence them quietly, another urged. The captain listened, then stood and said calmly, "We will fight lies with truth. We will not hide our struggle from our people." It was a risky gamble, but a brilliant one. Instead of playing the victim, he reframed the entire narrative. This was not Traoré versus traitors. It was Burkina Faso versus interference. It was not paranoia, it was proof. And in doing so, he transformed a conspiracy into a rallying cry. Internationally, the ripple effects grew impossible to contain. In Ghana, students marched carrying banners, reading "Why Not Us?" In Senegal, musicians sang about the Sahel rising. The African Union, once silent, began quietly reviewing its own security protocols. Even diplomats in New York whispered that something irreversible is happening in West Africa. And perhaps the most ironic reaction came from Paris itself. A senior official speaking off-record confessed, "We used to worry about Russia's influence. Now we worry about Traoré's." From a single rumor of betrayal, a continental movement was born. The plan meant to erase him had instead immortalized him. Because Ibrahim Traoré understood what few ever grasped: you cannot assassinate an idea whose time has come. What came next was not chaos, it was calibration. The same night he faced the crowd, Ibrahim Traoré convened a midnight meeting with his ministers and commanders. The doors closed, phones were locked away, and the captain spoke with the calm of a man who had already buried fear. If a nation depends on one man, he said, it is already lost. From that sentence came the blueprint for survival, not of a presidency, but of a republic. Traoré realized that coups thrive where institutions are hollow, so he decided to fill them with purpose. The first battlefield was the military. For generations, promotion had been bought through loyalty to patrons, not service to the nation. Foreign advisors shaped command structures, and intelligence units often answered to outsiders. Traoré ordered a purge of divided loyalties. Every officer underwent a vetting process. Rank advancement would now depend on merit, field record, and psychological evaluation. Salaries were standardized, benefits reviewed, and ghost soldiers erased from the books. For the first time, ordinary troops saw fairness as policy, not charity. He also began unifying intelligence networks under a single accountable command. Every report, every surveillance feed would go through a national security hub, not through foreign liaison offices. The message was clear: Burkina Faso's defense would serve Burkinabe interests alone. The second battlefield was civil governance. Traoré knew that guns could defend a leader, but only opportunity could defend a nation. Across the countryside, new community committees were formed, civilian councils coordinating directly with local defense units. Farmers and elders were invited to security briefings. School teachers sat beside soldiers, discussing how to rebuild burned villages. For the first time, governance felt participatory. This system came to be known as the Army of the People. Not an army ruling the people, but one living among them. When soldiers saw themselves protecting their own families, betrayal became unthinkable. And when citizens felt ownership of safety, coups lost their moral ground. Then came the economy. Traoré understood that corruption feeds rebellion. So he redirected mining revenues toward rural infrastructure, roads, clinics, and irrigation projects. He launched cooperatives that gave local communities stakes in the gold they mined. Instead of foreign corporations taking 90%, villages now earned direct shares. If the people profit, they will protect, he told his finance minister. Every reform carried a message: sovereignty must be lived, not just declared. But the most profound change was psychological. Fear, the invisible currency of coups, began to lose its value. In towns and villages, murals of Traoré in his red beret appeared beside Sankara's. But more important than the art was the attitude: Burkinabe citizens began to say we instead of he. Among his advisors, a phrase began circulating: the shield of legitimacy. It meant that Traoré's true protection no longer came from guards or guns, it came from faith. Faith that the institutions he was building would outlive him. That was his long game: to make power secondary to purpose, so that even if the man fell, the mission would remain. It was a lesson born from Africa's most painful chapters. Lumumba died, Sankara fell, but their ideas refused to vanish. Traoré wanted to end that cycle not by escaping fate, but by preparing the nation to survive it. In the quiet after midnight, he told his inner circle, "We don't build walls to protect me. We build roots to protect the republic." And in that single line, the young captain turned a conspiracy into a constitution. In Washington, the briefings were laced with unease. Reports arriving from Ouagadougou no longer described a fragile regime, they described a transformation. Burkina Faso has stabilized, one analyst admitted, but not in a way favorable to our interests. To the policymakers of the old order, Captain Ibrahim Traoré was not just a leader, he was a virus of sovereignty. A single carrier could infect an entire continent. His reforms had replaced dependency with self-determination, his rhetoric replaced obedience with pride. And that terrified them. At the Pentagon, defense officials warned that the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, was quietly reshaping the regional balance of power. What began as a security pact had evolved into a prototype of African unity, independent of NATO or France. 3 military governments now coordinate defense, trade, and resource policy, one intelligence cable noted. If this spreads south, the Western presence in West Africa will become untenable. In Paris, the reaction was sharper. French media framed Traoré as a dictator in fatigues. Editorials mourned the loss of democracy, ignoring that the democracy they defended was one managed from abroad. France's mining companies began withdrawing personnel, its military bases faced protests, and its diplomatic influence, once unshakable, started to crumble. Meanwhile, in Moscow and Beijing, analysts smiled. Russia deepened military cooperation through equipment and training, while China hinted at new infrastructure investments. But unlike previous eras, Traoré set clear boundaries. Partnership, he said, does not mean permission. His approach was pragmatic, not submissive, a balance that even his allies found unusual. In the United States, media reactions were conflicted. Some commentators called him Africa's populist soldier. Others, especially among older audiences, compared him to leaders from America's own revolutionary past. "He reminds me of Washington or Jefferson," one retired diplomat told PBS, "a man trying to build a republic out of the ashes of empire." Still, Washington's foreign policy establishment saw danger. The rise of Traoré challenged the foundation of U.S. influence on the continent, aid-based leverage. His success meant that nations could thrive without IMF loans or American approval. Think tanks warned of a geostrategic vacuum, as if African autonomy were a threat rather than a right. Across the Atlantic, Europe faced its own dilemma. Public opinion in Africa had turned decisively anti-colonial, and protests in Dakar, Bamako, and Niamey carried a single refrain: no more puppets. For the first time in decades, Western diplomats were not greeted as benefactors, but as reminders of an old wound. At the same time, a quiet admiration spread among ordinary citizens in the West, especially those old enough to remember the civil rights era or Vietnam. They recognized in Traoré's defiance something deeply familiar, a young man refusing to kneel before power. "He's not anti-Western," one columnist wrote. "He's anti-submission." But perhaps the greatest revelation came from within Africa itself. Traoré's rhetoric awakened a long-dormant confidence. In universities, young scholars began teaching sovereignty economics. In marketplaces, traders quoted his speeches like proverbs. And in government offices from Ghana to Tanzania, the question whispered ever louder: if Burkina Faso can do it, why can't we? That was the quiet revolution, the one the headlines missed. For the first time, the world wasn't just watching Africa change, Africa was watching the world react. And in that mirror, the old powers saw their fading reflection. The night in Ouagadougou feels different now. The streets are calmer, the checkpoints quieter. Yet no one mistakes this silence for peace. It is the silence of vigilance, the breath before history decides which way to turn. Captain Ibrahim Traoré still sleeps beside a loaded weapon, but the danger he faces today is no longer just physical. It is moral. Every reform, every speech, every act of defiance has made him a symbol larger than himself. And symbols, as history reminds us, can inspire millions or be destroyed to silence them. 40 years ago, Thomas Sankara dreamed of an Africa free from dependency, and a gunshot ended that dream. But this time, the ending hasn't been written yet. Traoré's revolution, this fragile, imperfect, defiant experiment, stands at a crossroads. One path leads to renewal, the other to ruin. He knows it. His people know it, and perhaps so does the world. Because what's happening in Burkina Faso is no longer just a local struggle. It is a mirror reflecting what every nation must eventually decide: who owns the earth beneath their feet, who writes their destiny. If Traoré succeeds, it will not be because of his soldiers or speeches, but because he convinced his people to believe again in themselves, in their country, in the idea that freedom must be defended, not borrowed. But if he fails, the consequences will echo far beyond the Sahel. The old powers will say, "We told you so." The corporations will return. And another generation will grow up believing that sovereignty is a fairy tale for dreamers. So tonight, as the lights dim over Burkina Faso, the question extends far beyond Africa. It reaches every viewer who remembers what real independence once meant. Do you believe that President Ibrahim Traoré's vision for Africa can survive the storm? Do you think a continent that has buried so many heroes can finally protect one who still breathes? If your heart says yes, then this is your moment to share that belief. Share this story if you believe the truth still matters more than the headlines. Subscribe if you believe that Africa's awakening deserves to be seen, not silenced. Because the next chapter won't be written by generals or journalists. It will be written by people who choose to care. And when the dust settles over this red earth, perhaps history will finally say that in 2025, Burkina Faso did not bow. It stood.